let's talk about exactly what you need to know and what you need to have decided before you can build an effective podcast strategy for your business. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. Welcome to the show. I am super stoked because we have a guest today. We don't do that very often, as you know, but I sat down with Monica a couple of months ago to do a podcast strategy intensive. There was a really clear early win. Before that, I want to talk about knowing enough. I'll be honest, this is one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get when we talk to somebody who is interested in podcast strategy intensives. And we say, hey, why not now? And they say, I'm not sure what I want to do with my business. I'm not sure where I'm at. I'm not sure I know enough is very frequently the language that's used. And that's frustrating because A, you generally know more than you think you know. You have more clarity than you think you have. And B, a great way to get clarity is to get outside of your own brain. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation today. That's why I wanted to invite Monica onto the show, because Monica is somebody who knows her audience and knows her business and knows her podcast very, very well. However, there are some shifts happening. There's a change to her show coming that we talk about inside of the episode, and that's creating some opportunities. That's creating some room for experimentation, both in the podcast and in her business, as she explores some new ways she wants to expand and some new ways she wants to serve. And sometimes that newness, in all of its excitement, can lead you to doubting that you have enough information, that you have enough clarity, that you can meaningfully answer the questions. In this case, I'm going to ask you, but you can put this in the context of hiring any expert, consultant, coach, etc. And I'm willing to bet that, like me, as I say that, you can think of a time where you were like, oh yeah. And maybe it's a time you hesitated and you ended up going through with it and it worked out really well. Maybe it's a time where you hesitated and you were like, no, I don't want to do that. Or maybe it's something you're doing right now. I don't at all speak from experience there, but we all have done this. And so I'm super grateful that Monica came on the show and is going to talk it through with us. And I really encourage you to listen in on how this process helped not discover some clarity, but see the clarity she already had, see the pieces she already had fitting together. It gave her some visibility on what was happening, a line of sight on what she wanted, because you have to get outside your own head sometimes. Anyways, ahead of this, I want to remind you to head on over to the podcast newsroom. If you like hearing stories like this one from other podcasters, we have a couple of really good episodes over there where I do some audits. We're opening up audits again. We're going to be doing some more this summer. So if you would like an audit featured over on the podcast newsroom, go to uncommonlymore.com/audit and submit your application, and we will get you scheduled for the summer. I'm really excited to roll out a couple of more of these, and I highly recommend going and taking a listen. It's a really good way to get a little bit of a feel for what it's like to hear, or what it's like to work with me one-on-one, what it's like to be in a intensive call, a strategy call, whatever figure our work together takes. And so head on over again to the podcastnewsroom.com to subscribe if you have not, and uncommonlymore.com/audit to submit your application for a free podcast audit that we will broadcast over on the newsroom. With that, I want to get into this conversation with Monica because it's a good one. I will catch you on the other side. All right, I've got Monica with me now, and I'm thrilled to jump in. Hi, Monica. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Stacy.
Can you let us know a little bit about you, your podcast, your business, and where you were when we decided to sit down?
Absolutely. I actually have 2 podcasts, which puts me in a slightly different situation. One podcast has been running for 15 years. It's called The Nutrition Diva. I am a nutritionist by training, and in that podcast, I really talk about the science of food and nutrition, pretty straightforward. But the podcast that I came to you for help with is called The Change Academy, and it's a newer podcast. It's about 3 years old, and I started that podcast to specifically, as you like to say, be a member of my sales team, to be a way for me to promote the services that I offer, the programs that I've developed, and to connect with people that might be interested in working with me and help them see whether or not this be a good place to work together. And that was the podcast that I really needed your help with.
What was going on with that podcast when we decided to sit down? Because you were getting ready to make some shifts.
That's right. So the podcast had just about gotten to its 3rd anniversary, and I was really pleased with the way we had started out and the results that we had gotten so far. But I had launched that podcast with a co-host, and he had decided after 3 years together that he wanted to step away from the podcast. So that was the big shift, that I was going from a partner podcast to a solo podcast. And at the same time, sort of separate from that, I was also taking an opportunity to do some reconstruction, some creative destruction in
I
the
like that.
business in the business that that podcast was created to support. Rethinking our offers, how we deliver them, what we're doing in that business. So it was a lot of change at once, and it left me feeling like, I don't know what the purpose of this podcast is right now because my business is sort of under construction, but I don't want to, and we're having this change in personnel. So it was a lot of change. And and I knew I didn't want to just pause the podcast until I had it all figured out because that didn't seem like a good strategy. That's how you lose listeners. They find their way to other programs that are still talking to them. So it was clear to me that I wanted to keep going, but I really felt very unsure about what my content plan would be, what my strategy for the podcast would be. So it was obvious to look for help. And I have to just say, I have colleagues who do coaching and offer services in related businesses who were singing your praises, like how much they had gotten out of their podcast strategy intensive. And that's when I reached out to you to say, hey, could you help me with this?
I love hearing that. I love hearing that people were sharing it with you. One of the things that I think is really interesting here is you mentioned this, you have an existing solo podcast. So some of the uncertainty of this was, how do we keep these different? What is the
Exactly.
differentiation? And I think that that's such an important piece of the puzzle. It's interesting. The Change Academy had a lot of changes
Yes.
that was happening kind of all at once.
Right, and that was a big concern for me. The podcasts are differentiated also by their topic and their focus. So, in the Nutrition Diva podcast, I'm really talking about nutrition science. In the Change Academy podcast, I'm really talking about behavior change, how people actually implement health change behaviors in their lives, because that seems to be where, well, it's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's not what we know, it's what we do. And that was the thing that my clients needed the most assistance with. So that is the focus of that other podcast. So they were differentiated in terms of what we talk about and what the subject and the focus and the content is. But yeah, I was afraid that because I already had a solo podcast, that going from a partner podcast to a solo podcast would feel like too much of the same thing. For one thing, I really enjoyed the difference in dynamic between a solo podcast and a conversational podcast, and I didn't wanna lose that.
I love that you're speaking to not just the deliverable for the listener, but the experience of the creation. Because I think that's something
Mhm.
we don't always necessarily consider, but that's how you go 15 years or even 3 years doing a show. is having that I'm gonna say this in a really weird way, but like that creativity scratched appropriately, right? That little bit of difference kind of helps keep things interesting and exciting, and those nuances are incredibly important when it comes to our experience as a host, because that is a big part of supporting us in showing up week after week and doing this thing, especially with a solo show where often it feels like we're just sitting in a room talking to ourselves.
You're so right. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but it was daunting to think of picking up that level of responsibility with both podcasts because it is such a different experience. Now, people who know me will know I'm also a bit of a control freak, so the solo podcast does have that going for it. I can completely control it, but I really came to enjoy, like you said, the creative process of working with another person and also just what it resulted in. The two podcasts sound completely different. It sounds totally different for you and I to be having a conversation where we don't yet know what the next part of it is going to be. It's unfolding in real time than it is for one of us to prepare a list of talking points and record a solo podcast where there's no surprises. It really sounds different to the listener, and I wanted to preserve that. But yeah, here I am. I've my co-host is moving on. I've got this podcast on my hands. I was paralyzed. I started listening to your podcast obsessively to the point where I was hearing your voice in my dreams, right? Because I thought,
I'm sorry.
no, I really felt like there is so much good, valuable information in this and in the podcast newsroom. I should be able to figure this out myself. Because the other concern here, of course, is as I mentioned, the business side is also at the same time simultaneously going through this big construction project. And while we're under construction, obviously, we are not inviting new people into the program. We are busy with the people that are already there and delivering their programs and very intensely engaged with them, but we're not letting anybody in right now because we're under construction. So, as may be obvious, that means a real change in revenue stream. And so the question for me was, how do I keep this podcast going, not spend a whole lot of money because I don't have a lot of money coming in right now. So I went to your podcast and I thought, all right, if I just listen to all of these, I will be able to figure this out for myself. So what I ended up with was pages and pages of notes and great ideas. And then I was still kind of paralyzed when it came to, okay, well then what's the next episode going to sound like?
I love that. And I think the financial component is certainly important, but there were some other hesitations to doing this now around some of the uncertainty of that construction. Can
Yeah.
can you can you speak to some of those sort of like, we'll call them yellow flags that we were like, wait, is now the right time? What were some of those things that you were like, I don't know if I can do this now because these things aren't here?
Right. Well, they really are kind of woven together, but I knew just from having listened to your podcast and talked with you a little bit that you were going to be asking me, what are you offering right now? Who is it that you're trying to connect with? What is the action that you want them to take so that we could build the podcast strategy, the content strategy to serve those goals? And I felt like I'm not sure I have the answers to those questions yet. And so the way that then got woven together for me in the financial situation is I don't want to make this investment and have go through this process before I have the answers to those questions. Maybe I would get more value, more return on this investment if I wait until I have those answers and then go through the process with you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think this sort of brings us back to that moment of paralyzation, that
Yes.
moment of like, I have all of this data, all of this stuff, all of these ideas.
Mhm.
How do I move forward? Was it that sort of moment of paralyzation where you were like, okay, it's time?
Oh, 100%. I actually had time blocked in my calendar. It was time to release an episode. We had taken a little hiatus, which we have done every spring. We call it our spring break. And we were getting to the end of that spring break, and it was time to record my first solo episode. And I had time in my calendar to do it. And when I started my process to start bulleting out what the episode was going to be about, I mean, I just stared at that document and I moved that appointment on my calendar to the next day. It's like, well, I'll see if I can solve this problem tomorrow. But I
Mhm.
got to the end of the week and I had made absolutely no progress. And that's when I realized, okay, I'm stuck and I really need some help. But of course, the happy surprise here was that the thing that I was afraid of, that I didn't have the information that I needed in order to make the best use of the podcast strategy intensive, it worked out exactly the opposite. I don't wanna get ahead of the story, but when we went through that process, I found myself leaving that process with that clarity that I had been missing at the beginning.
That paralyzation
Mhm.
and that moving of the appointment, because for me, and I talked about this in an episode we released not too long ago, signs it's time to make a change in your podcast, and this is one of the ones for me. Whenever I move a recording date, whenever that due date just keeps getting moved on a podcast task, whether it's a, like a planning session where I'm sitting down and I'm going to outline I'm essentially doing my own strategy intensive.
Right.
um but oftentimes it's that record. It's like, oh, this has been moved. I'll go and I'll look in Monday, which is what we use as our project management, and I'll look at the activity and I'll see how many times I've moved that. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's time to phone a friend. It's time to address this. And this is one of the reasons we built the podcast strategy intensive. It's one of the reasons that the quarterly production calls happen with our production clients, because sometimes you just desperately need somebody outside of your head to ask some questions, to give some ideas, to help filter and process some of those things that are happening in your head. And so I love that you said that specifically about moving that date, because that for me is such a red flag of like something here needs to be addressed.
Well, and, I have a little bit of an advantage because I myself work as a coach with other people. And so I know that one of the most valuable roles I can play for them is to be that space outside their head where they can share what's going on, what the information is, and I can often see patterns, solutions, options that they can't see because they're too close to it. Too close to it emotionally, too close to it just in all the ways, right? So
Hmm.
I know that from the other side, the value of having somebody who's just a little bit removed from the situation and knows what you're trying to do and what the challenges are, help you make sense of what feels like a completely chaotic field of information and options. Should I do this? Should I do that? So it was a relatively easy leap for me to realize that that's what I was needing. I needed somebody outside the situation to look at everything I'd collected. I knew I had good stuff there. I knew I had the building blocks and the materials, but I could also see that all those materials were lying in an unorganized heap, on my desk, and I needed somebody to help me start fitting the pieces together.
You're exactly right. We end up too close to it. It's the, what is that cliche? You can't see the forest through the trees kind of
Mhm.
situation, right? There's so much there. And often, so much of it is really good, but we have spent so much time thinking about it,
Yeah.
so much time breaking it down, that we need that fresh slate. We need that clarity. We need that perspective. So I love that you share that. Let's shift into sort of the realization that some of it kind of it's kind of chicken and egg, right? Like, do I need to know all these answers first and then I'll build the plan, or like will building the plan help me get some of those answers? And it sounds like during our podcast strategy intensive, some of those things you weren't sure you had became really clear.
They really did. I thought I was bringing you a really problematic situation in that I had, 12 episodes to plan and not a lot of answers in terms of what was I gonna be able to offer when, but, I did have a list of things that that were available, whether they were opt-ins, ways that people could just learn more about what it's like to work with me or do little programs or even just have a conversation with me so we could talk about what might be next, all of that. So I did have a little list of things, but when we started to kind of put them together, and this is the value of having a process, right? I'm not a professional podcast producer or strategist, I have my own expertise in a completely different area of content. But because this is your area of expertise, and you've walked, I don't know how many dozens, hundreds, whatever,
Mhm.
of people through this process. You have such clarity on how the things fit together that you were able to see patterns where I couldn't see them and help me start. And then once we started fitting just a few things together and I started to see a scaffolding, then I was like, "Oh, I see. And we can fit this here and then we'll get there and then this makes that possible." So, I was actually telling a friend of mine after we got off the phone that I went into this 2 hours feeling completely unsure and disorganized and paralyzed, and I came out of it not only feeling completely clear on what my next step was, but excited about it. That was the first time I started to feel excited about this next chapter in the podcast. Up until then, it was mostly just kind of dread, and
Yeah.
uncertainty, and, and a certain amount of, um, sadness that, okay, this chapter, which was great, is now ending and it's time for something new. But for the first time after, and I have to say, that's a pretty big shift to have occurred in just 2 hours. And I felt ready. Like I could have recorded that first episode the next day. Like that was the level of clarity I came out of it with. I said, okay, I see. Let's get started. And I'm excited to now I'm excited to get these episodes out there so we can start to see how we did, how it connects and how where it leads.
I love that you talked about the scaffolding because I think one of the things I talk a lot about when we build a strategy is we're kind of putting together a puzzle, but we have no picture. We don't know what we've lost the box, so to speak. We
Yeah.
don't we
Yeah.
don't totally know what we're trying to put together, but we have a general idea. Like there's a title. We have a general idea of the direction we need to be going in,
Mhm.
but we don't necessarily know how these pieces are going to fit together. And what's great, it's just like a puzzle. If you start putting that border together, right? If you start putting together one area, the more pieces you put together, the more obvious it becomes where the next pieces fit. And so I love approaching these strategy calls that way because it really does accelerate the amount of ideas we're able to get. This is why often I say, yeah, we're going to focus on 3 months. That's about 12 episodes, but often it ends up being 4 months or 5 months of episodes that we kind of come away with because again, once you start putting those pieces together, it gets clearer and clearer how the next pieces will fit in.
That's true, and that's a great analogy, and I think we did end up with 1 or 2 more episode topics than we needed to fill out our grid.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I can see I wouldn't wanna go too long before circling
Absolutely.
back and doing this again, because you'd wanna be informed by all the data that you've collected and everything that you've learned in the execution of that plan, and sort of refine and tune up. So I'm already kind of looking forward to the next one. There was one other element to this occurs to me that it might be valuable to share because it really was kind of virtuosic, I have to say, on your part. And that was
No.
that in this season of creative destruction, uh, somehow calling it a season makes it feel less scary, doesn't it?
I
It's a
like the language.
season
I
of
may steal
change.
it.
A season of change, not a catastrophe. Um, but part of the landscape of this was that I had shared with you that I am developing a new line of business that really involves a completely different end user. It's one that's existed in my business for a while. It's the more B2B level of my particular business. So instead of offering coaching services to individuals, it's offering coaching into businesses as part of their wellness programming. And it's something that I have been doing all along, but at a very low level. And I really decided I wanted to turn up the volume on that. I wanted to bring more of that into my business. But it was something that really had not been part of my marketing strategy up until this point. It really wasn't part of my content strategy. And one of the reasons I was so paralyzed by planning the content is I couldn't figure out how I was going to develop content for the podcast in a strategic way that would allow me to speak to kind of two different audiences without alienating either one of them and offer value on two levels. And you really helped me understand how I could do that in a way that felt like I wasn't really sacrificing or abandoning. any of my existing listeners that felt authentic to me, that felt integrated, and I really couldn't see how that was gonna happen before we went into that.
That was such a big part of our conversation,
Yeah.
and it's something that I talk a lot about with clients because I think it's easy for us to only see one way to, like, heavy on the air quotes here, win, right? There's only one version, there's only one thing that success looks like on the other side, and it's a pretty direct, like, someone listens and then they buy. That tends to be the process we think through, and there's a lot of ways we can come together and get messages out, get value kind of content out, and balance talking to two different groups of people who are maybe going to buy two different ways. And also use our existing listenership to help us get into some of these rooms and support them in a way that's not direct to them. There's so many opportunities with podcasting that sometimes it's easy to miss what all is there. And that's one of the things, again, I love about coming in to work with experts who are experts at what they do and have a lot of ways that they can support and connect and help them see how can we leverage the podcast to really feed all of these things as often as possible.
Well, it's a big lift. It's a big ask for a podcast because I think as content creators, and I do consider myself a content creator, I really get a lot of joy and satisfaction out of sharing information as an end unto itself. That's why I enjoy podcasting, right? At the same time, I want this podcast to serve a function in my business. But as content creators, we're usually trained to be very specific about who we're talking to. And so this idea of having these conversations kind of rolling on a couple of different levels was really a different spin, and it is tricky, but I feel like you gave me a lot of clarity, and one of the things that helped me understand that is that, okay, so we have different sorts of buyers who are buying different sorts of services, different contexts, but, all of the quote unquote business people who might be interested in bringing me in to work with their employees or their wellness programming, they are themselves individuals who are working on their own health and self-improvement. And the opposite is also true. Some of the people that were listening to my podcast purely for their own personal development also have jobs. And some of those jobs are in, areas of the business that I might want to speak to. So there was more crossover there than I think I had really appreciated.
Yeah, I think there often is, but to your point, because it is a heavy lift, it is something where you almost need to be even more strategic because there has to be thought around, cool, how does this serve A? How does this serve B? And then for C, how are we bringing this together so that I don't spend half an episode talking to group A and half an episode talking to group B
Yeah,
and we lose them in the other half.
right. Well, and as you and I both know, Stacy, there are lots and lots of podcasts that are putting out millions of minutes with absolutely no plan and no strategy. No, um,
Yeah.
not everyone goes into a podcast realizing A, its potential to serve this role in their business, and then B, with any kind of idea of how to make it fulfill its potential. And that's where I feel like you are really offering such a valuable service to podcasters.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I think you're exactly right. I want to start to wrap us up and I want us to, I want to hit some of the highlights. So, was there an unexpected win? I think we've talked about some of them, but was there anything where you're like, wow, I really didn't expect this? And you walked away with something like that?
I think I did mention it, and it was walking away feeling excited about getting back behind the microphone instead of feeling this kind of pit in my stomach and seeing the schedule in front of me, but being eager to create that first episode. That was pretty exciting and pretty welcome.
Thank you, and I was hoping you were going to say that again because it's maybe one of the most common, I call them side effects
Yeah.
of working with us, either signing the production contract or working with me, in the intensive. Most often, it's about 24 to 48 hours later, I get a message either in my DMs or in my email that says, I had no idea how excited I would be to do this. I haven't felt this way about my show since I had the idea to have a show. And it's because you really do spend so much time, even with a partner, you spend so much time podcasting, thinking about other people, thinking about delivering something that's
Hmm.
going to support, help, engage
Work.
others. And sometimes getting to spend some time talking to someone about what you want for your show, about what your show needs to deliver for you and your business, and getting re-engaged in what you both need to talk to the audience about next, but also want to talk about next
Yeah.
is really exciting and honestly a little freeing because again, we spend so much time, at least the podcasters I work and the podcasters who are doing this intentionally and to be of service, there's so much thought around how does this serve others? How does this help others? What do they need? That it can feel good just to reconnect with, like, why you like this thing, why you what and to your point, you are a creator, you are creative, this is as fueling for you as it is anything, but it's really easy to separate yourself from that in the day-to-day of chopping wood and carrying water.
Well, I feel like you should call the service "How to Fall Back in Love with Your Podcast,"
New
but you
tag.
right, but, I we all know it's more fun to do things that we feel like we're good at, like, when we feel like we have competence, it's just more enjoyable to do things, but I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's also more fun to do things where we feel like we have a solid, purposeful outcome and a plan to get us there that makes that because it is a lot of work. There is a lot of chopping wood and carrying water, and it makes that more enjoyable when it feels like, no, I have a purpose, and this podcast has a purpose, and I have a plan to fulfill that purpose.
Absolutely. I call it reconnecting with why I podcast. Like,
Yeah.
I need to remember why I do this for
Mhm.
X amount of hours per week or month
Right.
or whatever. It's a big time investment. It's occasionally a big financial investment. It's an energetic investment, especially when you're talking about a solo show. Even if it's only part time a solo show, like there's a lift there, and being excited about it is a massive value and makes it a whole lot easier to stop moving that recording date
Right.
down your calendar. All right, before we wrap up, can you I would love for you to just share with anyone who's maybe considering a podcast strategy intensive, kind of something you either wish you knew before or why how to stop hesitating and jump in because I know for you there was so much uncertainty because of all of the change that was happening in your business and in the show. Is there anything you'd want somebody else to know who's maybe past you maybe?
I think it's that, waiting for the change to settle out, to put your hands on the wheel is kind of the wrong strategy. You wanna steer through the turn, right?
It's absolutely so true. Sometimes the easiest way to navigate the change is to just show up fully in it.
Yeah, yeah, and some help in kind of charting out an uncertain future is exactly what's needed and what's helpful. It helped me answer some of the questions that I thought I needed to answer in order to go into the process. So I guess it was just I had the sequence a little bit backwards.
All right, before we wrap up, can you let everybody know where they can find Change Academy so that they can listen? Because it is a fantastic show. And I'm
Thank you,
very
Stacey.
excited for the new episodes coming out.
Yes, you have to come listen to Stacy and my good work, and it's called The Change Academy. You'll find it on all of the podcast platforms, and it's really for anyone who's interested in working on behavior change in their own lives, or for those who work on behavior change in communities or in workplaces. There's something for everyone.
I'm really excited about some of the conversations you're going to be having.
Me too.
Like, I'm really excited. I can't wait. So we'll link to that in the show notes. Absolutely. I want to thank you, Monica, again for coming on, for raising your hand and saying, I'm willing to share this because I think this will be incredibly helpful for some people who are considering a podcast strategy intensive, but are maybe not sure that they have the right sequence together yet.
Yeah, and you know what? I'd be happy to chat with anybody that has questions. feel free to pass them my contact info.
Awesome. Thank you so much. A huge shout out again and thank you to Monica for coming in and share this. Again, when you have these new opportunities, when you have these shifts that happen in every single business, it is really easy to feel like you've got to get them all figured out and then you can make plans. You have to get them all figured out and then you can get help. And often what leads to the clarity is making the move and getting help, is making the plans, is starting to answer some of those questions and put those pieces of the puzzle together. If you would like to sit down with me for your own podcast strategy intensive, we have spots coming up. Head over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive to learn all about it and to get yours booked. I will see you right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.